Hello all! Today I'll be working on a shawl made from donated secondhand yarn from elders in my community and talking a bit about figuring out that not only you're an adultier adult, but deciding what kind of adult or elder you want to be. I hope you enjoy. My name is Took. I'm a disabled genderqueer weaver who's had life take odd turns, but who knows that even tattered and worn yarn still has value, and that tired joints and health flares don't have to stop the journey. I weave exclusively with secondhand fibers, aid with adaptive warping, HR and OSHA cats, and a wonderful found family. Welcome to Hawk Song Weaving, where all our paths are a little bit warped. First, some clarifications because the English language is messy, and I don't want to have any confusion regarding what I mean by an elder and adultier adult. For me, an elder is an older person in the community who is a source of wisdom and guidance, while also acknowledging that they don't know everything, but know who to ask if they don't know the answers themselves. Elders shift from community to community. In the LGBTQIA+, I'm considered by some to be an elder at age 30, simply for having survived to that age. Our community has a strong lack of elders due to systemic pressures and the AIDS crisis. We've lost so much knowledge and community building, which is why there's so much discourse within the community. There's this sense of scrambling for lost time and lost knowledge. But I'm only a few years into realizing I'm trans, so a friend of mine who has been realized and out longer is more of an elder in that sense than I am, even though he's several years younger. For adultier adult, I mean that person who others view as always having their situations in order, as being perceived as knowing what they're doing all the time, presenting, well, like an adult. The distinction between the two, at least for me, is that adultier adults is what others view you as. It's a perception of the mask. Because so often the adultier adults are like ducks. They look calm on the surface but are frantically paddling underneath. Elder, on the other hand, is a conscious or unconscious choice to present yourself authentically, to admit that you don't know everything, and is actual maturity rather than the mask of maturity. I find that I do my best thinking when I'm working on a weaving project based on that thinking, which led to this choice in yarn. All of this yarn was donated to me by older members of my community. So given this thinking and figuring things out, I decided to weave a shawl titled Elder's Mantle. If you're curious about the adaptive warping method I'm using, feel free to check out the link in the corner. I'm going to do my best to remember to put it up there, but I have hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and with that comes a lot of joint hypermobility and chronic pain, so this is the warping method I've adapted to suit my needs. I found that most traditional warping pegboards were too heavy on my arms and my wallet, so instead I use a small accordion coat rack. I keep it pinned with the warping peg and the loom, and from experience I know what pegs to warp to get the length I want for a specific project. This is what works for me, and it won't work for everyone, and that's okay. Weaving has a long history, and while it's important to honor that when you can, it's just as important to not be in pain while you craft. You matter too. And while I was doing all of this incredibly heavy thinking, Hades was not having any of it and was clearly trying to insert himself between me and whatever was making me think sad, intense thoughts. So please enjoy the montage of him just slowly inserting his Maine Coon mix bulk between me and my warp. He does the same exact thing when I have therapy, is he just tries to push my laptop with my therapist on a Zoom as far away from me as he can. He's dumb like a box of rocks, but he's smart like a fox sometimes, and he knows what he's about. With the warp threads sorted, I'm lifting up the loom to release the warping board from the loom, gathering the warp threads into one large bundle, and using the back of my neck to drape them over and keep them tidy and out of the way, while I collapse the warping board and get it tucked out of the way until I'm at a full pause point. Moving the tripod so it's a little bit closer and there's a better angle, getting the terry cloth towels. I use terry cloth towels to cushion the warp threads. This helps prevent the finished weaving from being tighter at the ends and looser in the middle, creating a sort of sausage profile in the weaving. The way I warp has me cutting the warp loops at the end of winding the warp. This is what's easiest on my body. It won't work for everyone, but that's okay. This isn't a great angle, but I'm being careful to pay attention to how the warp threads are laying on the back bar of the loom, and the right hand thread goes through the smaller hole in the rigid heddle reed. It's not critical, and some minor mistakes aren't the end of the world, but it does make it easier to keep the tension of the warp threads even across the entire weaving. I'd like to thank you for watching. If you'd like to support my work, some free ways to do that are to like, subscribe, or follow, and share. This applies to other small artists as well. It's a great way to let the social media algorithms know that this is content worth watching. If you'd like to support me financially, there's a Buy Me a Coffee linked below, which acts as sort of a tip jar. Also, now that there are so many of you absolutely fantastic and wonderful subscribers, I've been able to link the online Hawksong Weaving shop, so feel free to check out the unique handwoven products. This next bit is absolutely a joke, but just in case, in this economy, I won't say no. For $1,000 a month, you can tell me that I'm not actually disabled, I'm just lazy, and to try whatever yoga, juice cleanse, snake oil nonsense fixed your cousin. Feel free to message me and I'll get you my payment deets. I take Cash App, Venmo, and PayPal for this nonsense. And there's a new exciting thing in the works. Some friends and I have started a new nonprofit, Mill River Marginalized Artists Collective. The Mill River Marginalized Artists Collective, or MRMAC, provides support, resources, and opportunities for marginalized artists by marginalized artists and our supporters. Separate we are small, together we are mighty sort of deal. Our goals are to get a retail space in which to sell discounted, reclaimed art supplies and art by marginalized artists of Western Massachusetts, and to offer grants to local marginalized artists for the purposes of purchasing art machines, looms, printing presses, printers, etc., digital advertising, art market vendor fees, transportation, and rental fees for the MRMAC retail space. The long-term goal is to offer a full lending library of art machines and other supplies, classes for artists by artists, and attend art markets on each other's behalf, though that one is much more of an immediate term thing. Essentially, we're unionizing and forming a guild. I'll attach the link tree down below. One of the best ways to help is to follow and share everything we post in order to get our content past the algorithm suppression. Because our existence has been deemed quote-unquote political, and apps like Insta and Meta and Facebook aren't going to share our work as easily. Attaching the warp to the bottom apron bar is pretty easy. I finger comb it, get it separated into bits about 4 to 5 warp threads wide, separate these bits into 2, and then do a half hitch tie to the apron bar, then onto the actual weaving. I loved working with this yarn. Variegated or ombre yarns are so much fun to weave, watching the colors flow as you build up the weft. tucking in the bottom terry cloth towel to again cushion the total project, and here we go. Tightening things up. I'm very careful with my thumbs because my fingers are hypermobile, and you can really easily dislocate your thumbs or your fingers if you're trying to put this much pressure on them. You can't really tell from the outside, but I am being very careful to brace them internally with my musculature because the joint itself is hypermobile. When weaving one of these shawls or stoles or whatever you want to call them, because I have a smaller loom, I weave them in 2 or 3 panels depending on how much yarn I have. In my last video on making a shawl, people asked how I made sure that the panels were the same length, and the short answer is I wing it. The longer answer is, due to my hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, I'm effectively dyslexic. Essentially, my eyes are hypermobile, and that causes problems with reading, especially with numbers. Math is incredibly difficult for me because the numbers jump around and don't follow patterns like words do, or at least patterns I recognize. I can pattern recognize words when I'm having a hard time with my eyes not cooperating, but numbers don't have that pattern for the math I'd be doing for weaving. So I guesstimate, and I keep track of how much spring the yarn has and use my loom as a measuring tool. And usually I'm careful to only use wool blends that will steam block more effectively for large projects like this. In the past, I've done blankets with only acrylic, and I bind the hems because I don't want to spend my time ramming my brain against my disabilities. I'd much rather spend my time and energy on actually weaving and sewing. But on to figuring out what kind of elder I wanted to be, because during all of this hawk song weaving development and mermac development, I kept being cast as an adultier adult, when again, I was a duck. I didn't know what I was doing, and I was so terrified of people realizing that. But I'm tired. I'm in my 30s, and I have what I'm realizing over and over again is a rare opportunity to decide what kind of person I want to be, what kind of elder I want to be, and actively work towards being that person. Because it's not enough to simply realize that you're an adult by the sheer fact of sheer horror that you're the same age as those who hurt you when you were a child or were bystanders. It's not enough to realize that you must be an adult because you could never be that blasé about others being harmed. I want to be kind, I want to be thoughtful, I want to be responsive and respectful, not only of others, but also of myself and my own needs. I want to respond to situations with a steadiness rather than continually reacting based on how my brain has been wired due to trauma. I don't want to lose my empathy. And I don't ever want my ego to take over to the point where I can't note and admit when I'm wrong and change course accordingly. Because yes, I and so many other autistic people have black and white thinking and that drive for justice. But just because something is black and white and correct for me doesn't mean that it's a universal truth at all. So I'm building the type of elder I want to be. Kind, compassionate, wise enough to know that I don't know everything, and seeking to understand others' perspectives while managing my own, admitting fault and fallibility, and never stagnating. But also remembering where I'm from. I'm remembering that my being able to decide what kind of person I want to be is a privilege that comes from my relative security in life right now. I'm remembering how many times I've reacted from that small animal brain place of survival and lashing out to keep myself safe. And I'm remembering in my drive for compassion that so many of the other people I encounter are still going to be in that small animal survival mode. And to offer grace, not as in lording it over them, but offering grace as if I've been there and will continue to be there in the future. Now tying off of this particular panel's fringes, I prefer to do 2x2 warps tied into a fringe of 4, but will do a double sliding knot of 3 if I don't have a wide enough warp. Now unrolling and getting the next bit of this, and here we go, we have our first panel. Before I sew the panels together, I steam block each of them. This allows the wool fibers to soften into each other and relax into the weave. Without blocking, you can get wrinkles because the weave tends to be stiff without the added heat and water. Sort of like how your back gets when you've been sitting in a not great position for too long and a boiling hot shower takes care of the knots. Because this is a wool-silk blend, I have my iron setting to wool blends, and even with that, I'm being careful not to rest the iron on one spot for too long. It's hard to tell with the camera angle, but mostly I'm just skimming the surface of the panel, letting the steam do most of the work as opposed to deep pressure and direct heat. Once all 3 panels were steam blocked, I moved everything I needed to my office, or studio, whatever you want to call it. For the sewing, I used the remaining dark purple silk and merino yarn that I used for the weft. I still had some left over that will cascade into future scarves. To avoid loose ends, I weave the sewing yarn into the actual fabric. I'll tie a knot at the very end of it, but I find that weaving in the loose ends helps keep things tidy. I started fiber arts with knitting, so this was a fairly easy step for me to take as I was working out this method for myself. The way that I sew these panels together that I found works best is to hook the needle through the weft loop of the selvage or the edge of the panel and the outermost warp thread at the same time, and to do a whip stitch jumping diagonally from each panel all the way up. Because I don't measure these exactly, there are a few points where I tighten one end of the blank and know that I'll steam block out those wrinkles down the line. Again, this is why I make sure to use wool or wool blend yarn for these larger projects. You'll note that I paused and stepped away to actually refill my water bottle because there was a winter storm coming in while I was starting this sewing and my pots was having a time, and it's always better to not pass out while you're doing your work, especially if you're working with pointy things like needles. Yes, it's a dull yarn needle, but you still don't want it to go into you. a bit more of a close-up, and I hope that this shows more of what I'm talking about regarding catching the loop and sewing on through. And now doing the final steam blocking. This is important, especially for those tightened bits from my measuring method so that they'll all smooth out. But because this is a wool silk blend, I'm still being really careful to keep my iron on a lower setting and not providing direct pressure with the iron. It would suck to be at this final steam blocking and melt this shawl. A belated Google search indicates that I was misled and that silk is generally not water soluble, and that the amount of care I was taking for this was probably excessive, but I regret nothing. Once the steam blocking is finished, I eyeball the length of the fringe that I want and use the "don't ask me how much I spent on these good shears" and trim it. The final step is between 45 minutes and an hour and a half of tying the fringe knots. This is one of the downsides of this particular method, but it provides just a nicer finished look for the finished product. And of course, Miss Penelope Calico had to have her 2 cents put in as well about me thinking intense thoughts while working on this. I'm so glad for her and Hades Himbo. They're both in various bits of paperwork as emotional support animals, or ESAs. This is different from a service animal because they're not trained to provide service in any way. They provide emotional comfort and support by being with me. At darker times of my life, knowing they were here has kept me on this planet. Both Hades Himbo and Penelope Calico help by providing pressure, companionship, and tactile comfort. Penelope Calico has added being a heart rate monitor for my postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome to her role, but she wasn't trained for that. She's just deeply opinionated and more than willing to scream her complaints to me. I adore her and I'm grateful for her, but I'm never getting another Calico, ever. Think tortitude and orange stubbornness all in one cat. Because of how I was raised and my background, I also use my cats to judge other people. I make very clear boundaries around how my cats are to be treated by people who come into my home, and if those boundaries aren't respected, I know that that person is unlikely to respect any of my own boundaries. These boundaries are pretty simple. The cats don't owe you anything. Don't feel entitled to their space. If they come up to you asking for pets, that is their choice. If you don't want to pet them, you can ask me politely to remove them from your space. But I had an ex-boyfriend who shoved Penelope off the back of a chair, and I should have broken up with him then and there, and I didn't, and I regret that. Thank you for coming along with me while I wove this elder's mantle and figured some things out about how I wanted to continue moving forward in my life. I'm so grateful for all of you for being here, and thank you for spending time with me at Hawksong Weaving, where we're all a bit warped, and I hope that you have a truly excellent week.